This is Bitnar Talks, the engineer takes on construction. Episode 35. Hi, I'm Piotr Bitnar. Each day I help my clients plan and design building projects through Bitnar Limited, a consulting chartered structural engineer's practice. My biggest passion and the cornerstone on which I've built my business is finding clever solutions for construction projects. I am a chartered structural engineer and a budding software developer, so you can rest assured that I will strive to talk about the best practices and the use of new technologies in the industry. And if you're embarking on a construction project or are involved in planning, designing and building the world around us, you'll find this podcast useful. Approved Document S, Infrastructure for Charging of Electric Vehicles. Hi guys, and welcome to Bitnar Talks, your favorite podcast on all matters of architecture, engineering and construction. It is Thursday the 14th of November 2024, and I'm here back with you with the 35th episode and information on Approved Document S, Infrastructure for Charging of Electric Vehicles. It has been another busy week dealing with all matters AEC, from simple assessments of cracks in the walls to advice on developments and designs of structures. I'm glad to be able to juggle it all with the delivery of this podcast for you. It makes the game constant but short breaks for recharging family life top my batteries up a little bit and make me plow ahead. This week we have launched a feedback gathering exercise within the domestic clients world. I wonder if you've seen it. If you haven't, look around, and if you do, give us a feedback back and tell us what you think about it. We ask simple to share your disappointments and lessons learned on your projects in an attempt to create a plain language guide for domestic clients. We are interested in views, opinions and experiences of house builders, extension builders, individuals and developers. We find that institutions fall short in addressing the issue, and we also find that professionals talk about the grievances more than actually being helpful, and it does not cut through and is not particularly helpful to people who initiate these projects. I hope you will engage with us on this one and send me an email or a LinkedIn message sharing your experiences. For now, let's go back to the delivery of these episodes, starting with the recap of the last one first. In the last episode, I talked about the Approved Document R, Infrastructure for Electric Communications, of which Volume 1 provides guidelines for ensuring new dwellings are gigabit ready. Requirement RA1 mandates that each dwelling has infrastructure capable of a gigabit per second, so 125 megabytes per second, either through wired or fixed wireless connections, from the access points to the nearest network distribution point. Exemptions include non-residential buildings, major renovations, and remote locations with high connection costs. Developers should engage with network operators early in the planning process, and they should reference Appendix B for building control requirements, a table with information that building control require. For compliance, infrastructure should prevent air or moisture intrusion, include fire stopping where needed, and meet flammability requirements in specific areas, so higher rise buildings and when you put your cablings on the walls. Each unit in multi-dwelling buildings needs its own gigabit capable termination point, with placement guidance reference made to NHBC's NF67 guide. Section 2 requires developers to connect new dwellings to gigabit capable networks in partnership with operators of those networks. If costs exceeds £2,000 per unit, developers may consider alternative connections, consulting at least 2 operators to verify the costs. Section 3 covers building control documentation, including installation evidence and exemption request if applicable. Volume 2 outlines infrastructure for high-speed networks, which is minimum 30 megabits per second when RA1 does not apply, typically for new builds or major renovations. Infrastructure includes a simple access point and termination point, with connections arranged by the developer as needed. Exclusions include remote, historic, and possibly even conservation zone properties. The past 2016 and NHBC Connected Homes Guide are recommended for best practices. In this episode, I'll move to the approved document S, Infrastructure for Charging of Electric Vehicles. So without further ado, let's dive straight into this. In this episode, I'll talk about the statutory guidance contained within the approved document S, Infrastructure for Charging of Electric Vehicles. The document covers the requirements of Parts S, requirements S1 to S6, and regulations 44D, E, F, G, H, I, and J. Both requirements S and regulations 44 with different letters come together as pairs. It is contained within 7 sections, section 0 to 6. It covers the introduction, charging provisions for new residential buildings, material change of use into dwellings, major renovations in residential buildings, buildings other than residential, either mixed use or not, or new or undergoing major renovations, as well as standards for charge points and cable routes. In the gist, if you don't want to listen to the rest of it, we need to make sure that new infrastructure, when we are doing a major work to the building, we use the occasion to upgrade it so we can charge our future electrical vehicles. For domestic reasons, we'll be thinking about enough provision for every single dwelling, whereas in other settings we'll be thinking about every fifth car. So let's get into the nitty-gritty of this approved document, shall we? Alright guys, starting with the text of the legislation first. The requirements S will be followed immediately with the associated regulation 44. The erection of new residential buildings, that's requirement S1.1. A new residential building with associated parking must have access to electric vehicle charge points as provided for in paragraph 2. Paragraph 2. The number of associated parking spaces which have access to electric vehicle charge points must be A. The total number of associated parking spaces where there are fewer associated parking spaces than there are dwellings contained in the residential building, or B. The number of associated parking spaces that is equal to the total number of dwellings contained in the residential building, where there are the same number of associated parking spaces as or more associated parking spaces than there are dwellings. Paragraph 3. Cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in any associated parking spaces which do not, in accordance with the paragraph 2, have an electric vehicle charge point where A new residential building has more than 10 associated parking spaces, and B, there are more associated parking spaces than there are dwellings contained in the residential building. Application of paragraph S1 of Schedule 1, the erection of new residential buildings, that's regulation 44D, paragraph 1. The requirements of paragraph S1 of Schedule 1 apply in relation to the erection of a new residential building with associated parking as follows. Paragraph 2. The number of electric vehicle charge points that must be installed in the maximum number of electric vehicle charge points that is possible to install at an average sum of £3,600 or less for the connection cost of each electric vehicle charge point connection, the so-called the 3,600 cap. Paragraph 3. If it is not possible to completely fulfill the requirements of paragraph S1, paragraph 2 of Schedule 1 as a result of the operation of the £3,600 cap, cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in the associated parking spaces that would otherwise be required to have electric vehicle charge points, but for the operation of the £3,600 cap. Paragraph 4, where the new residential buildings has or will have associated parking that is situated within a covered car park. A, if there are or will be any associated parking spaces situated in a position other than in a covered car park. Point I, the requirements of paragraph S1 of Schedule 1 must first be applied in relation to those parking spaces. Then I, if the number of associated parking spaces which are situated in a position other than in a covered car park is insufficient to completely fulfill the requirements of paragraph S1, paragraph 2 of Schedule 1, cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in sub-paragraph AA, the number of parking spaces in the covered car park, which, when added to the number of associated parking spaces which are situated in a position other than in the covered car park, corresponds to the total number of dwellings with associated parking, where the total number of associated parking spaces is 10 or less. Subparagraph BB, all the associated parking spaces in the covered car park, where the total number of associated parking spaces is both less than the number of dwellings with associated parking and 10 or less, and subparagraph CC, all the associated parking spaces in the covered car park, where the total number of the associated parking spaces is more than 10. Going back to subparagraph B, if all the associated parking spaces are situated in a covered car park, cable routes for electric vehicle charge point must be installed. Subparagraph I, where there are 10 or fewer parking spaces. Subparagraph AA, in the number of associated parking spaces in the covered car park, which corresponds to the total number of dwellings with associated parking. Subparagraph B, in all the parking spaces where there are fewer parking spaces than there are dwellings. Going back a notch to subparagraph I, in all the parking spaces in the covered car park where there are more than 10 parking spaces. Moving on to requirement S2, dwellings resulting from material change of use, where one or more dwellings with associated parking result from a building or a part of a building undergoing a material change of use. At least one associated parking space for the use of each such dwelling must have access to an electric vehicle charge point. Application of paragraph S2 of Schedule 1, dwellings resulting from a material change of use. That's Regulation 44E. Paragraph 1. The requirements of paragraph S2 of Schedule 1 apply to a building or a part of a building undergoing a material change of use to result in one or more dwellings as follows. Paragraph 2. The requirements of paragraph S2 of Schedule 1 apply A. If subparagraph I, the circumstances specified in Regulation 5A, B or G apply. And subparagraph I, the material change of use involves building work being done with, which includes work being done to any of the following. Subparagraph A, to a car park that is located within the side boundary of the building, where the nature of the work is such that it would be reasonable to expect that work is to include enabling the requirements of paragraph S2 of Schedule 1 to be fulfilled. Subparagraph B, the electrical infrastructure of a car park, where that car park is located within the side boundary of the building. Subparagraph C, the electrical infrastructure of the building where a car park is located inside the building. Going back 2 notches to point B. Paragraph B, subject to paragraph 3, if an electric vehicle charge point of each dwelling resulting from a building or a part of a building undergoing a material change of use can be accommodated within the incoming electrical supply to the building without having to upgrade the capacity of the incoming electrical supply to the building. And C, if the building is not one in relation to which paragraph 4 applies. Now paragraph 3, if paragraph 2A and C applies, but electric vehicle charge points for some but not all of the dwellings resulting from a building or a part of a building undergoing a material change of use can be accommodated within the incoming electric supply to that building. A, the requirements of paragraph S2 of Schedule 1 apply in respect of the maximum number of electric vehicle charge points that can be accommodated within the incoming electrical supply. And B, Cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in the associated parking spaces that would otherwise have been required under paragraph S2 of Schedule 1 to have had electric vehicle charge points installed. Paragraph 4. The requirements of paragraph S2 of Schedule 1 do not apply if a building or a part of a building is a. listed in accordance with the Section 1 of the Planning Listed Buildings and Conservation Areas Act 1990, b. in a conservation area designed in accordance with Section 69 of the Act, or c. included in the schedule of monuments maintained under Section 1 of the Ancient Monuments and Archaeological Areas Act 1979, where compliance with the requirements of paragraph S2 of Schedule 1 would unacceptably alter the building's character or appearance. Paragraph 5. If the building or a part of the building undergoing a material change of use to result in one or more dwellings has or will have associated parking that is situated within a covered car park, subparagraph A. If there are or will be any associated parking spaces situated in a position other than in a covered car park, subparagraph I. The requirements of paragraph S2 of Schedule 1 must first be applied in relation to those associated parking spaces. Then, subparagraph II. If the number of associated parking spaces which are situated in a position other than in a covered car park is insufficient to completely fulfill the requirements of paragraph S2 of Schedule 1, cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in subparagraph AA. All the associated parking spaces in the covered car park, where the total number of parking spaces is less than the number of such dwellings with associated parking, or subparagraph BB, the number of associated parking spaces in the covered car park, which when added to the number of associated parking spaces which are situated in the position other than in a covered car park, corresponds to the total number of such dwellings with associated parking. Subparagraph B. If all the associated parking spaces are situated in a covered car park, cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in I. All those associated parking spaces, where there are fewer parking spaces than there are such dwellings with associated parking, or subparagraph II, the number of those associated parking spaces that correspond to the total number of such dwellings with associated parking. Moving on to requirement S3, residential buildings undergoing major renovation, where a residential building undergoing major renovation will have more than 10 associated parking spaces after the major renovation is completed. Subparagraph A. At least one associated parking space for the use of each dwelling must have access to an electric vehicle charge point. B. Cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in all additional associated parking spaces. Application of paragraph S3 of Schedule 1, residential buildings undergoing major renovations. That's regulation 44F. Point 1. The requirements of paragraph S3 of Schedule 1 apply to a residential building undergoing major renovation as follows. Point 2. The requirements of paragraph S3 of Schedule 1 apply if a. The major renovation involves building work being done which includes work being done to any of the following. I. A car park that is located within the side boundary of the building, where the nature of the work is such that it would be reasonable to expect that work to include enabling the requirements of paragraph S3 of Schedule 1 to be fulfilled. II. The electrical infrastructure of a car park, where the car park is located within the side boundary of the building. III. The electrical infrastructure of the building where a car park is located inside the building. B. The residential building will have more than 10 associated parking spaces upon completion of the work. C. Subject to paragraph 3, all the required electric vehicle charge points can be accommodated within the incoming electrical supply to the building. D. The cost of installing all the required electric vehicle charge points and cable routes for electric vehicle charge points does not exceed 7% of the total cost of the major renovation. And E. The residential building is not one in relation to which paragraph 5 applies. Paragraph 3. If paragraph 2a, b, d, and e applies, but all the required electric vehicle charge points cannot be accommodated within the incoming electrical supply to the building. A. The requirements of paragraph S3 of Schedule 1 apply only in respect of the maximum number of electric vehicle charge points that can be accommodated within the incoming electrical supply to the building. And B. Cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in all remaining associated parking spaces. Paragraph 4. If the cost of installing the required electric vehicle charge points and cable routes for electric vehicle charge points exceeds 7% of the total cost of the major renovation, the residential building is exempt from the requirement to install any electric vehicle charge points. Subparagraph B. Cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in all associated parking spaces except where the cost of that installation exceeds 7% of the total cost of the major renovation. Paragraph 5. The requirements of paragraph S3 of Schedule 1 do not apply to a residential building which is undergoing major renovation for the principal purpose of improving the fire safety of that external walls or roof of the building. Paragraph 6. If a residential building undergoing major renovation has or will have more than 10 associated parking spaces, A. If there are or will be any associated parking spaces situated in a position other than in a covered car park, I. The requirements of paragraph S3 of Schedule 1 must first be applied in relation to those associated parking spaces. Then I. Cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in all the associated parking spaces in the covered car park. B. If all the associated parking spaces are situated in a covered car park, cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in all the parking spaces in the covered car park. Now moving to requirement S4. Erection of new buildings which are not residential buildings or mixed-use buildings. Where a new building which is not residential building or a mixed-use building has more than 10 parking spaces, A. One of those parking spaces must have access to one electric vehicle charge point, and B. Cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in a minimum of 1/5 of the total number of remaining parking spaces. Application of paragraph S4 of Schedule 1, erection of new buildings which are not residential buildings or mixed-use buildings, Regulation 44G, paragraph 1. The requirements of paragraph S4 of Schedule 1 apply to the erection of a new building which is not a residential building or a mixed-use building, new buildings, as follows. 2. If such a new building has or will have within its site boundary more than 10 parking spaces, A. If there are or will be any parking spaces situated in a position other than in a covered car park, I. The requirements of paragraph S4 of Schedule 1 must first be applied in relation to those parking spaces, then I. If the number of parking spaces which are situated in a position other than in a covered car park is insufficient to completely fulfill the requirements of paragraph S4 of Schedule 1, cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in a sufficient number of parking spaces in the covered car park in order to ensure compliance with the requirements of paragraph S4.b of Schedule 1. B. If all the parking spaces are situated in a covered car park, cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in a minimum of 1/5 of the total number of those parking spaces. Now moving to requirement S5. Buildings undergoing major renovation which are not residential buildings or mixed-use buildings. Where a building undergoing major renovation which is not a residential building or a mixed-use building will have more than 10 parking spaces after the major renovation is completed, A. One of those parking spaces must have access to one electric vehicle charge point, and B. Cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in a minimum of 1/5 of the total number of remaining parking spaces. Application of paragraph S5 of Schedule 1, building undergoing major renovation which are not residential buildings or mixed-use buildings, Regulation 44H. Point 1. The requirements of paragraph S5 of Schedule 1 apply to a building undergoing major renovation which is not a residential building or a mixed-use building, as follows. Paragraph 2. The requirements of a paragraph S5 of Schedule 1 apply to such a building if A. The major renovation involves building work being done which includes work being done to any of the following. I. a car park that is located within the side boundary of the building where the nature of the work is such that it would be reasonable to expect the requirements of paragraph S5 of Schedule 1 to be fulfilled. II, the electrical infrastructure of a car park where the car park is located within the side boundary of the building. III, the electrical infrastructure of the building where a car park is located inside the building. Paragraph B. Upon completion of that major renovation, the building will have more than 10 parking spaces situated within the side boundary of the building. Subparagraph C. The cost of installing the required electric vehicle charge point and cable routes for electric vehicle charge point does not exceed 7% of the total cost of the major renovation. Paragraph 3. If the cost of installing the required electric vehicle charge point and cable routes for electric vehicle charge points exceeds 7% of the total cost of the major renovation, A. Such a building is exempt from the requirements to install the electric vehicle charge points, and B. Cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in a minimum of 1/5 of the total number of parking spaces, except where the cost of that installation exceeds 7% of the total cost of the major renovation. Paragraph 4. If such a building has or will have within its side boundary more than 10 parking spaces, A. If there are or will be any parking spaces situated in a position other than in a covered car park, I. The requirements of paragraph S5 of Schedule 1 must first be applied in relation to those parking spaces, then II. If the number of parking spaces which are situated in a position other than in a covered car park is insufficient to completely fulfill the requirements of paragraph S5 of Schedule 1, cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in the number of parking spaces in the covered car park in order to ensure compliance with the requirements of paragraph S5b of Schedule 1. Subparagraph B. If all the parking spaces are situated in a covered car park, cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in a minimum of 1/5 of the total number of those parking spaces. Now moving to requirement S6, the erection of new mixed-use buildings and mixed-use buildings undergoing major renovation. Paragraph 1. The requirements of paragraph S1 apply in respect of the part of the new mixed-use building that contains one or more dwellings and the associated parking spaces that are assigned to those dwellings. Paragraph 2. The requirements of paragraph S3 apply in respect of the part of the mixed-use building that is undergoing major renovation that contains one or more dwellings and the associated parking spaces that are assigned to those dwellings. Paragraph 3. The requirements of paragraph S4 apply in respect of the part of the new mixed-use building that contains one or more new premises that are not dwellings and the parking spaces that are assigned to those premises. Paragraph 4. The requirements of paragraph S5 apply in respect of the part of the mixed-use building that is undergoing major renovation that contains one or more premises that are not dwellings and the parking spaces that are associated to those premises. Now, application of paragraph S6 of Schedule 1, direction of new mixed-use buildings and mixed-use buildings undergoing major renovation, Regulation 44I. The requirements of paragraph S6 of Schedule 1 apply to the erection of a new mixed-use building and a mixed-use building undergoing major renovation as follows. Paragraph 2. The requirements of paragraph S6 of Schedule 1 apply if, upon completion, such a mixed-use building will have at least one parking space situated within the side boundary of the building. Paragraph 3. If such a mixed-use building has or will have within its side boundary a covered car park. Subparagraph A. If there are or will be any parking spaces situated in a position other than in a covered car park. Subparagraph I. The requirements of paragraph S6 of Schedule 1 must first be applied in relation to those parking spaces. Then II. If the number of parking spaces which are situated in a position other than in a covered car park is insufficient to completely fulfill the requirements of paragraph S6 or Schedule 1, cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in accordance with II. Regulation 44D4A in relation to the associated parking spaces for one or more dwellings in a new mixed-use building. B. Regulation 44F6 subparagraph A in relation to the associated parking space for one or more dwellings in a mixed-use building undergoing major renovation. Double C. Regulation 44G, paragraph 2, subparagraph A, in relation to the parking spaces for one or more premises that are not dwellings in a new mixed-use building. Double D. Regulation 44H, paragraph 4, subparagraph A, in relation to the parking spaces for one or more premises that are not dwellings in a mixed-use building undergoing major renovation. Now, subparagraph B. If all the parking spaces are situated in a covered car park, cable routes for electric vehicle charge points must be installed in accordance with I. Regulation 44D, paragraph 4, subparagraph B, in relation to the associated parking spaces for one or more dwellings in a new mixed-use building. Double I. Regulation 44F, paragraph 6, subparagraph B, in relation to the associated parking spaces for one or more dwellings in a mixed-use building undergoing major renovation. Triple I. Regulation 44G, paragraph 2, subparagraph B, in relation to the parking spaces for one or more new premises that are not dwellings in a new mixed-use building. IV. Regulation 44H4B, in relation to the parking spaces for one or more premises that are not dwelling in a mixed-use building undergoing major renovation. Now, minimum standards of an electrical vehicle charge points, that's Regulation 44J. For the purposes of this part and Part S of Schedule 1, an electric vehicle charge point must meet the following minimum standards. Paragraph 2. It must be capable of providing a reasonable power output for each parking space for which it is intended to be used. Paragraph 3. It must be run on a dedicated circuit. Paragraph 4. It must be compatible with all vehicles which may require access to it. Interpretation of this part and Part S of Schedule 1. Cable route means a safe, unobstructed route from the power supply to the envisaged electric vehicle charge point location for electrical cabling to be installed in the future. Oof, there's quite a bit circling around the same information here, really. So it will be easy breezy going through sections now. But it was, 15 minutes just reading the bloomy legislation. Anyway, let us start with section 0, which tells us where are these requirements applicable, like new residential buildings, new non-residential buildings, buildings undergoing a material change of use, residential buildings undergoing major renovation, non-residential buildings undergoing major renovation, or mixed-use buildings undergoing relevant building work. The section also mentions typically associated requirements to think of, like B, K, M, and P. So section 1 deals with new residential buildings. As ever, the Secretary of State's view is simple. The requirement S1 and Regulation 44D are met as long as you follow the document. So we are talking about new residential buildings here, with associated parking spaces, and the amount of charging points should be associated with either the number of parking spaces or a number of dwellings these spaces serve. So if there are no parking spaces within the boundary, we do not need to provide a charging point. If some parking spaces are not required to have charging points, we should prime them for future installation with cable route if the cost of charging point connection would be over £3,600, or some of the spaces are a covered car park. The minimum number of charging point or cable route is either the number of parking spaces or the number of dwellings that the car park serves. If there are more than 10 parking spaces and these more than the number of the dwellings, all the additional parking spots should have cable routes for all associated parking spaces. Associated parking spaces are just spaces within the boundary or in the control of the building owner. The requirement for the charging point applies when the car park is not covered and the cost of connection of such is less than £3,600. The connection cost is the extra cost of the incoming electrical supply per electric vehicle charge point. To provide the cost, we will need to present 2 quotes to building control during the notice plans stage. At least 1 quote should be from a distribution network operator. The quote should show the total average cost per dwelling, excluding the cost of charging points as well as including such costs. The average additional cost per dwelling when charging points are installed for all dwellings served with the parking space. The maximum number of electric vehicle charge points that can be installed until extra grid connection cost exceeds £3,600 per charge point per dwelling. So simple, we just talk about the connection with the supplier and spreading that across all the different dwellings and trying to provide as much as possible. Section 2 goes on to deal with material change of use and major renovation for residential buildings. In this section, both the requirement S2 and S3 are covered, as well as the regulation 44E and 44F. So let us start with material change of use. Okay, so this happens when we either add dwellings or flats or remove them from the building. The requirements are similar to the previous, with the difference that the number of points needed to meet the number of newly created dwellings. So we cater for the new. As ever, historic and traditional buildings are always should be treated delicately when it comes to integrations of change of their appearance. Depending on the type of the building and its setting, it may not be required to provide a charging point or have it provided at the point approved by the conservation officer. This requirement applies when undertaking a material change of use for every newly created dwelling where we will not need to upgrade the electrical supply to the building, where the parking is not within a covered car park, when works do not alter appearance of a historic or traditional building, and when at least one of the following works is being done. Works like parking resurfacing or installing new electrical infrastructure, work to the existing infrastructure, work to the electrical infrastructure of the building when the car park is located within that building. If the existing infrastructure does not have the capacity, we will need to provide this to the building control by sending them documentation like a written statement from a suitable expert or the distribution network operator. In such case, we should install as many as we can and make it future ready with cable routes. Also, the requirement to install charging points in covered parking spaces does not apply. Instead, the cable route should be used. Now, major renovation of residential buildings will come with its own challenges, including providing charging points where the renovation is major. The works does not include solely the upgrading of the fire safety of the building fabric, and there needs to be more than 10 parking spaces for use by the dwellings. Renovation work included car park resurfacing or installation of electrical infrastructure work to the existing infrastructure and work to the building infrastructure where the parking is contained within it. Here also the number of charging points will need to meet either the number of dwellings the car park serves or the number of associated parking spaces. Application of major renovation requirements to residential buildings. We should think about future-proofing the building, but not at all costs, and the document basically limits us to either the existing power supply that needs to be sufficient in its present state, or not to more than 7% of the total capital cost of the renovation works. The more points, the better. So if we can achieve more with the cable routes in the budget, we should think of cable routes. The associated parking space must not be within a covered car park. The cost should include the installation, meaning the point and the route, but excluding VAT and other costs like land, statutory fees, financing, maintenance and operational costs. Covered car parks in buildings undergoing material change of use or major renovation. Well, it permeates throughout the document. If there are no outside space for the charging point, then do not install one under cover, but do cable routes instead, which by the way should be sufficient to serve the number of dwellings or all spaces if the number of spaces is less than the number of dwellings. Moving on to section 3, New buildings other than residential or mixed-use buildings. In this section, we are being told that in new buildings other than residential or mixed-use with more than 10 parking spaces, one electric vehicle charge point must be provided for the building and at least one for each 5 remaining parking spaces. We need to provide cable route. This applies to the parking space within the building or the side boundary. The preferential position of the charging point and cable route is not within the covered car park space. If all there is covered car park, then the requirement of the charging point is no more, but the cable routes remain. Section 4 deals with major renovation of buildings which are not residential or mixed-use buildings, where similar provisions apply here, but there must be at least 10 parking spaces for the building users provided following the works. The major work constitutes same work as previously. If these conditions are met, then one charging point must be installed and a cable route for each of 5 remaining parking spaces provided. That means for 11 spaces, we must install 1 point and 2 cable routes. The limits on application are the same as with the renovation in regards to the cost limited at 7%, as well as the position of the charging point being outside of the covered area. However, the 1 in 5 cable route requirement remains in place in any circumstance. Section 5 deals with mixed-use buildings, and in the case of mixed-use buildings, we approach it from the perspective of new buildings as well as the major renovation works, and we mix the requirements S1 and S4 proportionally to the use. Simple. For major work, we need to establish the proportion of parking spaces assigned to each use or treat for the more onerous option, meaning residential. Similarly, like previously, we think the external installation of charging points and cable routes first before providing such undercover. For particular applications, we are referred to the sections that deals with the particular use, so the aspects I've already covered. Now, Section 6, Standards for Electric Vehicle Charge Points and Cable Routes. The guidance starts with the reminder of Regulation B, Fire Safety, and P, Electrical Safety, as well as the Electricity at Work Regulation 1989, and the HSE's HSR 25, the Electricity at Work Regulations 1989 guidance and regulations. Generally, the charging point should be designed and installed to BSEN 61851 electric vehicle conductive charging system, be of minimum 7 kilowatts nominal rated output and have universal untethered socket. It should be fitted with an indicator to show charging status, be of minimum mode 3 specialized system running from the dedicated circuit or equivalent. To follow BS 7671 requirements for electrical installations and the IET's Code of Practice electric vehicle charging equipment installation. We are also reminded on the applications of other legislation that may impact the installation, like the Alternative Fuel Infrastructure Regulations 2017. Now, for the cable routes and locations for electric vehicle charge points, this should be positioned so it is convenient for vehicles with different positions of inlets. We should also think about the accessible parking spaces where at least one such space should have a charging point or a cable route, or be prepped for future installation. The best place for the point would be considered away from the maneuverable spaces of the wheelchair users and further from dropped curbs. If the position of the point can be so to share between 2 spaces, it should be so positioned. For the cable routes, this should be provided from a metered electricity supply point to the future connection location. The route, connection and position of the future connection should be all well thought and proper, meaning sufficient space, labeling and marking, and prepping for future use. In addition, it may be also prudent to think about auxiliary elements that come with the installation of charging point. When cable routes are installed, these installations should follow a strategy for future charging points to BS 7671 and IET's Code of Practice for EV charging equipment installation. The strategy will follow the considerations of likely locations of future point and how the power supply to the charging point will be earthed. The cable route should be so prepped so there is no necessity of building work for laying of cables, and so it complies with BS 7671, 8300 Part 1, IEC Code of Practice. Underground cable ducts should follow BSEN 61386 Part 24 and be easy to lay cable in, not damaged during backfilling, have draw rope with termination points accessible in future. Building fabric penetration should be sealed in regards to vermin, water, air, gas and fire. Color coding should follow NJUG's guidelines on the positioning and color coding of underground utilities apparatus. The size, specification, band radius of all cable ducts should be such to allow future connections. The network operators should be informed when the service is modified. Future locations for the connection should be identified and labeled, and there is a spec for that too, which is, make it say, dedicated position for electric vehicle charge point in 25mm high letters over 3 lines within 506mm by 194mm signs. That's pretty specific. Signs should be weatherproof for the location and readily visible for the future installer. The future connection location should have space for the charging point, including space for reaching an electric vehicle, access to install and maintain the point, vehicle barriers if need be, with sufficient space around the future connection location. The typical required space is shown on the diagrams within the document. For floor-mounted stations, we need to think at least 220 by 450 for the station, and at least 1.5 meter to the side of it, and 0.5 meter to the back, with the height of more than 1.2 meters. For wall-mounted, however, we think 200 by 400 box for the charging point, at least 800 millimeters to the sides, and between 700 to 1 meter free space underneath it, with the height of the actual box of over 500 millimeters. So this is it, folks. The approved document as infrastructure for charging of electric vehicles. Let's sum it up section by section. In Section 0 gives a scope of application. These requirements apply to new residential and non-residential buildings, buildings undergoing material change of use, and both residential and non-residential buildings undergoing major renovations. Mixed-use buildings are also included where relevant building work is undertaken. Other applicable regulations to consider include requirement B, K, M, and P. Section 1 talks about new residential buildings, where for new residential buildings with associated parking, requirement S1 and regulation 44D are met by following the document. Charging points must be installed based on either the number of parking spaces or the number of dwellings served. If no parking spaces are present within the property boundary, charging points are not required. For spaces without charging point, provision should be made for future installation if the cost is below £3,600. Proof of connection cost must be shown to building control with quotes, including one from a distribution network operator. Section 2. Material change of use and major renovation of residential buildings. Well, material change of use for buildings undergoing a material change of use requirement S2 and S3 and regulation 44E and 44F apply, especially when adding or removing dwellings. Charging points should be installed to meet the number of new dwellings, particularly if no major electrical upgrades are needed. Historical traditional buildings may be exempt or require approval from conservation authorities. Major renovation, for large-scale renovation with over 10 parking spaces, charging points are required based on the number of spaces or dwellings served, subject to budgetary limits of 7% of total renovation costs. Covered parking spaces do not require immediate charging points but should have cable routes for future installations. Section 3 deals with new non-residential buildings, for which with more than 10 parking spaces, at least one charging point is required, plus cable route for every additional 5 spaces. Cable routes should ideally be installed outside of covered parking areas. If only covered parking is available, cable routes must still be provided if immediate installation of a charging point is not required. Section 4. Major renovation of non-residential buildings. Well, in non-residential buildings with over 10 parking spaces, post-renovation, at least one charging point and additional cable route for every 5 spaces are required. The installation cost should not exceed 7% of the renovation's total capital cost. As in other cases, charging points should preferably be located outside covered parking areas, but cable routes must be installed regardless. Section 5 deals with mixed-use buildings, and for mixed-use buildings, requirements are a blend of those for residential S1 and non-residential S4. Structures proportionate to the building's use. In renovations, the more rigorous residential standard generally applies. Charging points and cable routes should ideally be installed outside with internal installations only if necessary. Section 6. Standards for electric vehicle charging points and cable routes. Well, the standards mandate compliance with relevant fire safety and electrical safety regulations like BSEN 61851 for charging systems and BS 7671 for electrical installations. Charging points must be at least 7 kilowatts, have universal sockets and follow appropriate safety codes. Future cable routes should accommodate easy installation, be clearly marked and complying with standards for accessible, durable and safe infrastructure. Placement consideration should account for accessible parking and appropriate spacing for ease of future installation. In the next episode, we will move to approved document T, toilet accommodation, brand new regulation. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that the considerations of the approved document S infrastructure for the charging of electric vehicles are a bit clearer for you now. If you have any questions, reach out to me on LinkedIn or send me an email. I'm more than happy to help you out. In Bitna, we deal with planning, designing and managing of your projects, and we are always glad to facilitate a free initial consultation to steer you in the right direction. Visit www.bitna.co.uk and reach out to us. Whether your question is if we can help you with your project or what should I do, we will be able to give you a piece of no obligatory advice. At Bitna, we help our clients design and execute their dream homes or investments. If your building is falling apart, we can also help investigate the reasons behind it and to provide you with an appropriate strategy, design and specifications for the repair. Thank you again for listening. Please voice up your opinions. I'm waiting for you on LinkedIn and I want to hear from you. See you next week. Bitna designs the world around you. Toodaloo.